Welcome into this executive training on reframing DEI and racial equity in the workplace with me, Kemi Joseph, and lessons from Dr. King. Very much an honor to be here with you today. And as we kick off, we'll be sharing quite a bit of quotes from Dr. King so we can really model his leadership and really take those lessons into your work in the workplace. And one of my favorite quotes to start with is, "The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people." And I start with that because, like many people, I have stayed silent about the injustices that I've seen. I mean, I've been on dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of Zoom calls, but I'll never forget the one on May 26th, the day after the murder of George Floyd, right here in this office with my team. And I was apologizing to them because I thought that since I started to succeed more in America, that America was getting better for Black people, that I was able to kind of keep my head down and just continue to thrive. I mean, I toured around this country in 2012, the same year that Trayvon Martin was murdered. I left Florida just around that same time. And I felt like because I was safe and I have multiple cops in my family, that race relations were even getting better in that way. So to see that murder in such an appalling, in your face, we're all experiencing it at the same time type of moment for us. For me, I had to take a step back and really deal with the guilt that I was feeling in that moment, the shame, the silence, the frustration. I'm the kind of person who doesn't want to add more hurt to the world. I want to add more healing. So on the May 26th, right here in front of these cameras, I was talking to my team just in tears and outlining, really sharing with them for the first time this vision I've had to really embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion work, because I've been avoiding it since it felt so painful. But we gave ourselves in that moment permission to make it more enjoyable, to make it more impactful, to make it more uniting. What you're going to see today is a culmination of that decision, plus all the effort we've been making to align ourselves, to progress this work, to help build it in organizations around the world and help to scale at another level what Dr. King already set off through the civil rights movement and through everything else that's come afterwards. So thank you for being with us in this moment of time. We strive to take all that has been driving people away from each other and use that to fuel us together. So you can type the word together in the chat if you want to go forward together. My name is Kemi Joseph, and I am the CEO of Fears Advantage. And Fears stands for Fuel Equitable Actions, Relationships, and Systems. We are on a mission to help 5 million leaders advance equity in their organizations by 2030, to create more company cultures where every person, every employee can work safely and thrive. And because diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI has been so intense, our promise to you is to make DEI initiatives actionable, profitable, and even enjoyable. So we can ensure you get the 5 ROIs of DEI. I know I keep saying the word DEI, so let me just make sure I give you a definition that we can have at least working for this session here. Diversity is the presence of differences among people within a given setting or team. Equity is the practice of ensuring that processes and policies fairly provide equal possible outcomes for every member of your team. And finally, inclusion, the practice of ensuring that people feel a sense of safety and belonging in your workplace. So this is the definition that we offer to make sure we can at least have some alignment with these conversations here, because what we often have to do is spend a lot of time talking about what DEI is and what DEI isn't. And ideally, when we go through this conversation together and really help to reframe it for you, you can walk away with a unified vision of that as well, to then bring back to your team and help people actually feel like they can welcome these conversations as opposed to repel them. Now, that means the objectives for today is to understand the true meaning of advancing equity in your organization, to help your teams welcome positive change so you no longer have to shoulder the burden alone. Learn how to get your executive team aligned on meaningful DEI initiatives so you can make progress with more confidence and less resistance. Who could use less resistance? We can give that to you alone. That'd be fantastic. So the final piece here is that you get a clear path to DEI success based on MLK civil rights leadership and case studies of companies making forward profit and progress, so you can take your next steps with clarity and certainty. That is what we're here to offer with Fear's Advantage. Now, in our time together, we have about 40 minutes left. Because we have 3 objectives, we're going to cover 3 portions of our framework. So we'll cover fuel, equitable, and actions. So we'll spend about 10 minutes in fuel. As we get into the fuel section, again, sharing a quote from Dr. King, that the ultimate measure of a leader is not where you stand in moments of comfort and convenience, but where you stand at times of challenge and controversy. We are at an unprecedented time of challenge and controversy. And yes, it's some ways it feels like things have improved. In other ways, it feels like, oh, wow, we didn't realize how bad things were. And in the middle of that is us as leaders, especially those of us who are leaders in the business world or somehow leading our teams or our communities. It's important for us to understand where we stand, and what we share from that vantage point makes a huge difference for the people around us. And what's interesting is we're seeing such a divide around these 2 words right here, racial equity. If we can offer a definition here, that racial equity is fairly and systematically giving all people, in honor of their race, color, or creed, what they need to live safely and thrive. And this is thriving at work, at home, and in the community. I think most people can say, okay, I can intellectually see this definition, but what does it look like? Go and find some Google searches. Yes, you're going to see a lot of images of people having the different equity tiers and saying, here's a wall or a gate, and then you have people on boxes. It's like, okay, why do we have to stand in front of a wall or a gate and then have these boxes? We're trying to conceptualize things in a couple of images. We're trying to reduce quite a bit into images, which is very difficult. So you won't really find that. What you also won't find is people that have full agreement over this. And part of the reason is we're trying to put so much into racial equity that our journey is going to be, how do we actually break it apart into the dimensions that are required for us to take what's massive, break it down into chunks that we actually can make progress on. And that way that each one of you can see from your vantage point where you have the greatest influence and ability to make a positive change. So type the word positive change if you want to see that scale where you can make that positive change. And as you're writing in the chat, I want to say thank you for contributing and going along this journey with us. So we put racial equity at the middle here. And we say that when people are talking about racial equity, what it's really breaking down is to what we would call equity pathways. So we have family equity, health and mental health equity, career equity, economic equity, housing equity, educational equity, governmental equity, environmental equity, spiritual and religious equity, social and relational equity, and legal equity. This is really what we're talking about, and people just try to slam it all into racial equity. And it's important that as we're having this conversation, we must realize that over here we have social and legal equity, which is what people will generally lump it together as social justice. Now, these certainly impact the workplace, so this is not what we see as leaders, as business leaders, that we are fully responsible for. What we're fully responsible for as business leaders is career equity. However, these dots are very connected. As Martin Luther King once said, that injustice here is a threat to injustice everywhere. Just like inequity right here is a threat to equity everywhere. Because what each human being needs, if we were saying having you right here in the center, what each human being needs is this pathway to gain equity in all areas of their lives. I'm going to explain this in a moment, but I want us to focus more so on the dimensions of these pathways, because our focus where we have the greatest impact is right here in career equity. And when I say we, it means Sphere's advantage, because we realize that adults spend most of our waking time at work. And then when COVID happened and businesses shut down, we saw the whole world shut down. So we really see the impact that small businesses and large businesses have on our lives on a day-to-day basis. We said if we're focusing on improving people's working conditions and their ability to work safely and thrive, we're increasing their ability to thrive in their lives, because as people have career equity, full career equity, then we see how that increases their ability to have equity elsewhere in their lives. So from our perspective, when we talk about what we have the greatest influence, we focus in on career equity. Now, you may have influence elsewhere. That's absolutely fine. We also share our resources with people who are committed to advancing equity in those other pathways as well. We're seeing as Sphere's Vans, we know where we can do the most good right here in career equity. So the question becomes to you as you see this, is where do you have the greatest ability to make a positive impact? Where do you have that influence? For those of you who have a job, who lead teams at work, or who run your own business, you're going to be with us in career equity right now. And then we can also reframe diversity, equity, inclusion as providing diverse solutions with equitable outcomes, and then taking inclusive actions to get there. This is the high level what I want to do with fuel, because if we understand what's been fueling us apart, we can then understand how to fuel unity by changing the way we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So from here on out, we're only talking about career equity. And I appreciate the clients that give us a chance to have these conversations, because when the piece I just showed you on the equity pathways, I had one person who said, Kimmy, I'm just so overwhelmed. I don't know. I have a big heart, but all I can see is the hurdles. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. Does anybody else feel that too? Right? You can give the heart emojis if you can relate to that. You have a big heart, but all you can see is the hurdles. So right away we started to, when we focused in on career equity, it was like a light bulb went off. I felt this person breathe differently, because we were not asking business leaders, business owners, folks who run teams, we're not asking you to save the world. We're asking you to make a positive impact right where you are, the people you work with every single day. This is all that I'll have to say right now about the fuel portion, because we're going to get ready for the bigger pieces of this puzzle. So hopefully you're going along with me as we keep on building. The next piece here is equitable. Equitable, equitable, equitable. You're going to keep hearing these words, because this is becoming the defining factor here. When people start to talk about equity, we look at equity as fairness. We're in a time where people often say that the world is unfair. So we're asking people to increase fairness in their lives, in their workplaces, in the world, when they have experienced life being unfair to them. So it's important that we have to honor that and then still continue to shift it. And one of the greatest examples of that is Dr. King. The amount of unfairness and injustice he experienced, but he would turn around and say his life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? So when you're thinking about your position in the workplace, what are you doing to help people feel more included? What are you doing to help to increase the fairness within your team, within your organization, for people to be able to rise up? What are you doing to ensure that people can actually be themselves and bring the diversity that really makes our country, what makes our world great? When we get back to this conversation around career equity, I want to spend about 15 minutes on this portion, because another thing that Dr. King was really great at was casting a vision and a dream that we still talk about today. So this portion, we're not only helping cast a vision, but also look at how do we measure it and make progress towards it. So with the career equity, we start to measure awareness, access, opportunity, safety, belonging, resources, development, advancement, and autonomy, as well as legacy inside of your organization. So awareness becomes this conversation that if we ask your team if they are informed about various career development and advancement opportunities accessible to them in your organization and what is needed to access those opportunities. And you notice already we separate career development from career advancement. We already know some teams have relatively flat structures. So there may not be a lot of career advancement in your organization, but is there career development where somebody can actually grow and learn and become a better version of themselves while working in your company? Now, access becomes measuring that they have fair entry points to apply for those relevant career development or advancement opportunities aligned with their skills and values. Opportunities then being invited to participate in roles or projects that will help to lead them to that greater advancement and development after they invest their time and effort. Now, if you start to really track along with these questions, all of these are based on the people who are already on your team. Some folks believe that solving DEI is about just, okay, we all of a sudden have to start recruiting people we've never really talked to and engaged and given a chance before. We're saying you can really start with the team you already have. If you're already asking these questions or measure what we're measuring here in career equity in this pathway, how would your team answer, your current team? Because then we can start bringing it another level closer to us, what we can actually do to impact. Instead of thinking about hypothetical people that we may hire one day and how they might rate these questions, how would your team, how would you right now on this call be rating your levels of safety and thriving inside the organization? So as we continue with these questions, the next part is safety. I am free from physical, intellectual, psychological, and emotional harm in my role. Belonging. I feel included because of my authentic identities and contributions are acknowledged, considered, and valued, especially in decisions that directly impact me. Now, you already notice we separated safety and belonging because some people are safe because they're hiding who they are. Belonging is that sense of feeling safe as who you are. When we have resources, I have the best available tools, information, and support needed to do my job effectively. Development, my role is optimizing my talents with relevant training opportunities to expand my skill set and capacity. Advancement, I have upward mobility on a clear path for role expansion aligned with my career goals. Now, these last two are some of my favorites and some of the hardest to attain here. Autonomy, I have the independence to do the work I'm hired to do with the freedom, trust, and ownership in my role. And finally, legacy. I am making a lasting, meaningful difference through my role while receiving the compensation and benefits that enable thriving in other areas of my life. Now, we've given the definitions, and some of you already asking in the chat will certainly be able to provide those to you for sure. It's important at a high level to know that what we are doing at Fears Advantage is measuring these and helping organizations to increase their level of thriving across the board, because this is how many organizations are structured. That if you look at this as a traditional org chart, that the people at the bottom, so entry-level positions, only get the bottom pieces that are required by EEO, where you have to have equal access and opportunity for people. If this is what you give to your bottom tier folks or to your entry-level folks, if you give them the bare minimum, they will give you the bare minimum. Some folks say, okay, great, once you become a manager or some kind of leader, then you start getting belonging, resources, development, and advancement. And then when you finally get to the very top is when you have legacy and autonomy. What's interesting for us is that this will still create inequity. When we start to deny people certain rights because of their position, if we're delaying those rights, we're still denying it. And there's people who are fed up with this kind of structure at this point. And we're seeing that happen where people are leaving the workplace in mass exodus because they're done with this way of operating. So again, if we follow Dr. King, he led off with a dream of what can we see as an alternative. Here's what we see as an alternative. Call this career equity. This is thriving at every level. Every person on your team thriving at every level. What's very interesting, some people see this, and some of the questions we receive from clients are like, wait a minute, does that mean someone who just joined our team will get the same level of autonomy as the CEO or somebody who's been here? Or what about the resources? How can we, now we start going down these questions where people are trying to justify the old way. And some people will even say, oh, this looks like some communism. I'm like, don't be throwing those words at us. We do not take those limiting beliefs. For one thing that we're doing in our team, for example, that gives all of us autonomy is that we're in the process right now being coached through doing this to have everyone on our team have 30 hours is full time. So it means from the executives all the way down to people who are just starting with our team. So it gives an incredible amount of autonomy, meaning that as we go on this journey, we'd actually be able to give people back 13 weeks of their time back of their lives every year. If we look at time as something that we all have to deal with, that's a great example for us of like, how do we actually set it up to where everyone can operate autonomously? Will we have different responsibilities? Absolutely. Will we have different pay? Yeah. But there's also organizations that challenge us to strive for baseline salaries of $75,000. I don't know if you've heard that movement happening. It's just so inspiring to us. So we're seeing people saying, here's the baseline. Baseline people come in and their needs are taken care of so they can focus on doing their best work and thriving alongside each other. And that increases the ability for everyone to continue to rise up. So when people are stuck with DEI and they're saying, we don't have a DEI problem, ask them if you have a thriving problem in your organization. Is everyone in your organization thriving? To all the leaders out there, is this something that you actually want for your team? Because the fairest thing that you can do, if you do not want all your team members thriving, if you believe that you can only thrive when they get to the executive level, if that's what you believe, I'll tell you right now, the most equitable thing we can do is say that is fair for you to believe. It's also fair for you to tell your team that, because they know that they're not going to thrive in your workplace, and that's not really where you want them to go either, then the fairest thing to do is just let them know that, and they can make their decisions on whether or not they want to stay there. Right now, we have a lot of people who say they want this, but their behaviors do something completely different. That's out of alignment, that's out of integrity, that actually continues to fuel more fires and frustration. So the next question becomes, well, Kimmy, how do we get there? You have to assess where you're at first. So we turn this very diagram, this very methodology into assessments, and we believe that we have to assess instead of make a mess, right? So let's look at it. If we start to assess, I want to show you on the left here what you'll see. When you see any green bars, that means a favorable score. So people who answered questions and they said that they agree or strongly agree. If it's in white, then it'll be in neutral. They said that they neither agree nor disagree. And if it's in red, that means they said disagree or strongly disagree. So when we ask questions like before that I feel safe from intellectual harm, if people said strongly disagree, it would be in red. If they said neither disagree or agree, it would be in white. And then if they said agree or strongly agree, it would be in green. So let's look at these scores. These are scores similar to what we've seen with clients last year. Now, if we measure their team, here's how some of the information is coming back. Now, as you're seeing this, it's important to think about, what if your data came back like this? Well, your team wasn't even aware of how they can grow. Some people do not even understand how pay and promotion work in their workplace. How pay and promotion, like that, how can they work for pay they don't understand? This is interesting, right? So we can look at these scores alone and say, now people start to say, okay, we have a problem. But Kimmy, this is just data. How does this kind of connect to DEI? Well, great questions. The next piece, if we start doing any kind of demographic comparison. So if you're gathering data and you're not gathering it to be able to filter by demographics, then you're never going to really see what kind of DEI issues you have. So I'll tell you right here, one of the key things you can do, especially if you're doing employee engagement surveys and pieces and things like that, make sure you're gathering demographic data so you can do a version of what we're about to show you right now, which is having a demographic comparison. So if we choose just the demographic on race or ethnicity, since we're talking about racial equity here, it's important to then say we can filter out, and I'm just using an example here, by white and then by black, right? So that same data set, all of a sudden, the scores get drastically higher for the group who identifies as white and drastically lower for the group who identifies as black. So now we can clearly see that we have inequity gaps inside of your organization. If this was your data what would you do about it? We're not asking you to save the world. We're asking you to make sure we can close the gaps inside of your organization. Because it's important to know that if you had it like this, where anybody based on any demographic that you split could rate high scores, this is how you know that your people are working safely and thriving. Notice that we're not even asking you to aim for perfection. This is 90% favorable and 10% neutral. That means that we let 10% account for the world sucking sometimes, for work sucking sometimes, that we don't always want to be at work. We don't always get along with our coworkers. That's fair. Let's just put that at neutral where people say, yeah, we're going to account for that. What if your team feeling like they belong at work, that they're safe, that they actually have a pathway to thrive is the norm in your culture? That's the big questions that fuel us to make sure that we can be as equitable as possible as we build our company as our vehicle of freedom. For Brian, Fardos, for Sarah, for all of us who have been working on this, we want to make sure that everybody we hire, everyone we come in contact with who works with our team has that same pathway forward. This is the dream. That closes us out on equitable, that we talked about fuel, we talked about equitable. And if y'all saying, hey, I love that dream, how the heck do we do it? Type the word actions in the chat if you want to know how to do it. Right? Type the word action in the chat. I love it. Thank you. So the actions piece. So we'll spend the last 10 minutes talking about action. And I love when I think about Dr. King's work, and we know that for one of the biggest things that he received acknowledgement for was the Montgomery boycott, which lasted over a year. But what's interesting is that they didn't start thinking that they were going to be boycotting for a year. They just started with one day. And he says that faith is taking the first step, even when you can't see the whole staircase. So they started on a journey to improve the circumstances in Montgomery, Alabama, even before they understood what that full journey would entail. A lot of folks have started DEI journeys without fully knowing where they're even going and what is needed to get there. One thing that we were saying at the very beginning is that you can't mandate things like love. You can't mandate things like inclusion. You can't mandate maturity. It really takes people to go on their own journey, and that we as leaders get a chance to guide our team in an inclusive way towards the types of maturity that we're going to need to really do this work well and enjoy it along the way, right? This is the piece. People keep saying, let's just do the work. We're like, let's enjoy it along the way. Because if we're not doing that, people will continue to get burned out. People will continue to get frustrated and keep these conversations behind closed doors versus actually having them in a way that builds the trust and safety needed to have them more openly in the workplace. So in terms of showing you the staircase, we have realized that there are stages of DEI maturity that every organization is in. Our research, our experience with clients have shown us that there are 5 key stages, and you are in one of these stages. So as you see this diagram, pay attention to where you are. There's initiating, aligning, progressing, building, and scaling. In the initiating phase, you want to grow DEI in your organization, but don't know where to start. In the aligning phase, you want to increase awareness, buy-in, and training around DEI issues in your organization. Progressing, you're starting to adopt practices that strengthen levels of trust, safety, and belonging needed for an inclusive culture. And building, starting to establish equitable processes, policies, and goals across your organization. Finally, scaling, starting to systematically integrate DEI into revenue generating and distribution efforts. So this is when you're getting clear on how you make your money as well as how you pay your people. These are the 5 stages of DEI maturity. And part of the reason we're wanting to share this, yes, it's going to help you when you're working with us, but it's also going to help you when you're working with any consultant, because sometimes organizations need multiple people, which is why I said we share our resources with other consultants and make sure that practitioners understand where to go. The saddest thing, one of the saddest things from last year for me was that we actually had to fire one of our clients who paid us for services that were in the scaling bucket. They were doing strategic planning and they felt like they were there, they were ready, but they actually were in an initiating phase. So if you're in a phase, but grabbing the wrong resources and tools, it's going to be a frustrating journey for you. And there's no shame and blame on knowing where you are. It's most important to know where you are and where your team is collectively, so we can get the right tools and the right resources to go forward in the smoothest fashion possible. So we're going to share with you how we have now put together our offerings to make it as clear as possible that wherever you are, we can support you. It's important to look at this next diagram, and you'll also see this on our website. Most of this will be accessible on our website. So think about our client success journey based on your DEI maturity. So on the left, you'll see the products and services, and then these columns on the right will talk about the different stages. And again, whether you are using us for these things, it's important to know whatever these actions that you're taking, where does it fall in the stages? And are you doing things that are relevant for your stage where your team is? For example, we do these free monthly trainings because we know that people are in the initiating phase all the time. So we want to be able to support them right where they are and make the cost of learning very low. And then we have the DEI Leadership online course that can help you as an executive, as a leader, really reframe how you're operating on your own and then bring that to your team. Then we have executive roundtables where, for example, we will have meetings with key executives and help them strategize around a challenge. A lot of folks come to us for recruiting, and we help to actually look at their recruiting pipeline in a short period of time to better help them understand where are the barriers to access, the barriers of entry. That's just one example. We have keynotes very similar to this, where we get to come and have an hour together, where we get to hear from me or any of the other speakers in our roster about the powerful ways you can align your team and move forward with a diversity, equity, inclusion focus. Then we have action class, where we get into the skills, where we get into actual skills, and we build it into practice sessions so people can have a support system that allows them to develop the skills needed to be more inclusive, to be more equitable. Now, one of my favorite services is the Executive DEI Leadership Coaching. And notice my dog even started barking. She's getting excited about that. So notice with the executive coaching, it goes across all of the dimensions, because what we find is that executives need some thought partnership. We are not DEI police. We're not vocabulary police. We're thought partners. It has been my greatest honor to help some of my clients rework some people love thinking out loud. I don't know if you're one of those people who loves thinking out loud. We've helped clients not necessarily think out loud with their whole team and about new issues that are emerging with DEI, because sometimes in that thinking out loud, we end up hurting our team members because we're saying things without really thinking about the impact. So oftentimes, one of my favorite things is being able to be a coach and have our coaches be there for folks, to be thought partners, to help evolve the way you're thinking and make sure that your goals as an executive, wherever you're going, we can help you get there in the most inclusive and equitable way possible. Now, the other piece is implementation coaching. The number one thing people did last year was start DEI committees. But a lot of DEI committees realized that they were DEI book clubs because they didn't have support, they didn't have the funding, they didn't have functional authority to actually get things done. So with implementation coaching, we help you and your DEI committee, as well as anyone, if you have a task force, or even if you're just a group of individuals together in your organization saying, hey, we want to build this forward, we help you to strategically implement what you're looking for. And this is becoming one of our top services, because folks are like, hey, we're in a group and we're all excited, but we don't know what to do next. We're here to help, for sure. And then we have the drop-in coaching, which we kind of label as problem-solving sessions. You know, with the executive DEI leadership coaching, this is when one leader has committed to doing it, and we never want to force coaching on people. So when you start, sometimes it might be good to have drop-in coaching available to your other executives and leaders and managers, because then people, sometimes people don't think about DEI until there's a problem, which then makes DEI the problem. We're like, okay, the fairest thing to do is say we get it. That's how most people operate. So drop-in coaching are kind of like problem solving or emergency triage sessions, when then your team can have the support and have people to go to within your organization and make sure that all the problem solving is reducing more problems, right? It's not fueling other more problems. Then we have assessments. And notice it comes in later in the sense of sometimes folks who are just starting out, it's better that we actually have some alignment with your executives even before launching an assessment, because a lot of folks will gather assessment data, not know what to do about it, and they're also not ready to solve the problems the data has identified. And if you're in that place, again, that might be a great opportunity for like implementation coaching or something to get your team to say, okay, we identify the problems. Let's put them in order. One thing that we're also seeing now is there's a culture, we're developing a culture where people are saying, what about me? And we start to support one group and other groups like, what about me? And it's the sad piece is because people are not seeing the dots connected. So you absolutely have the permission to focus in on one group, especially a marginalized group, underrepresented group, and help them in your organization. But please communicate to the rest of your team how this is building. That's some of what we help you to do in the implementation coaching. And then metrics and tracking so we can support the progress moving forward. And then learning and development planning. What we've really had to do this year is embrace our role as educators. You probably caught me last year saying, how much more education do you need to treat someone like a human being? I was also a person when I was younger who got expelled out of my elementary school for throwing chairs across a classroom full of other kids and constantly being in fights and being suspended and even having really tough encounters with police. And if I think about what it was that helped to shift it for me, it was the caring education, not just education, because some people say go educate yourself, but sometimes feel like go screw yourself. Like the caring education that helped me to see what I could do differently and also gave me the support system to do that. That's what we're here to offer with a learning and development plan. That way people actually feel inspired. So if you're creating a learning and development plan, are you creating one that's just like people check the boxes and these are to-do list items, or does it give people a chance to figure out who they want to be in your organization, give them to be guidance, so that way they can really authentically embrace what's coming next? And finally, we have the strategic planning. So we call it 3 to 5 year strategic thrive planning. It's in the building and scaling phase because it really takes your organization to be ready to have conversations of what does it look like to grow diversity, equity, inclusion at the highest levels, including doing pay equity audits and things that allow us to have a solid barometer for how we pay our team members, how we bring in revenue and share that revenue within our organization. Now, not every company is ready for that. That's what I'm saying. This is down the line, but we love the companies who are. Again, we shared examples of people who have done pay equity audits and say, well, we know at minimum our team needs $75,000 to have that sense of their needs are taken care of. So then they start building from there. And there's organizations who are doing this. It's not pie in the sky. There's organizations doing this right now. But the point of all this is to say that each and every one of you is at a different place in this journey. And the most equitable thing we could do is say, find out where you are in this DEI maturity journey, and then get the appropriate resources. So we're offering everyone here a free DEI maturity assessment. And we'll give you the link that will be right here on our website at fearsadvantage.com. And that way you go right to it and it helps you to do what I wish more people were doing in the very beginning of this, is to assess the DEI maturity. Because if you can do that alone, you're going to save yourself a lot of frustration, overwhelm. That way you don't have to do it on your own anymore. Because if your whole team took this, right, especially your executive teams, and there was a lot of misalignment, you can breathe and say, great, I'm glad we realized there was misalignment before we began. Let's figure out how to get some of that alignment in order to make sure that whatever we build, any initiative that we build, can be actionable, profitable, and even enjoyable. So as we start to close out, I just wanted to leave you with that. Again, fearsadvantage.com. It'll take you less than 3 minutes. It's fantastic. And even as you go through, answer the questions, you'll already be like, oh, great, we can do this. That's, if you get that away, wow. Now you don't have to do it alone anymore, which can bring us to this quote here. It says, all labor that uplifts humanity has dignity and importance and should be undertaken with painstaking excellence. Think about all that we're doing to invest in coaches and make sure that we do this right. So I'll tell you, if you're just trying to figure it out on your own, stop trying to do it by yourself. It does require some excellence, some support, some guidance. And we're here to help you at every stage to go from right where you are to where you want to be. I'll say thank you. As we close out, I actually want to share a tribute song that I created in honor of George Floyd, as well as so many that we've lost in this journey. It's called Breathe. All right, when this is done, we'll transition into Q&A. It's been a year since the murder of George Floyd. This song is dedicated to him and everyone else that we've lost because of senseless violence, especially racially motivated violence. For those of us who are still here, still breathing, we still have time to make things better.
So what do I do? 'Cause it feels like I'm going under, and my heart feels heavy. But I know now, yeah, I know I've gotta be stronger and make sure I can breathe.
2020 was already deadly. Then we saw a gut-wrenching lynching televised by a cop with death in his eyes. He knelt for 929. George made it to 846, but still in the course to try to make it out like he was sick. A character assassination so obvious, trying to justify the death of an unarmed black man who was already in cuffs for a fake $20. It doesn't matter if you're a crook or play by the books. Life is breathtaking until your breath is taken. And they tell us while we're lying and shaking that we're supposed to keep on waiting for justice to be served, but actions speak louder than words. What are you doing to stop the hurt?
So what do I do? 'Cause it feels like I'm going under, and my heart feels heavy. But I know now, yeah, I know I've gotta be stronger and make sure I can breathe.
In this culture of lethargy, I keep leading to increased equity. I see hope dying, the light dwindles out, but I'm trying to bring it back with this mouth to mouth. If hope died today, I would blame myself, 'cause I didn't do enough to help. I thought as long as I was black and winning, that America was beginning to be a better place. So his death was a punch in the face, truly a call to arms, but I don't want to do no harm in a system that kills. I want to be one who heals. What about you? What's your why? As long as we're alive, we can unsubscribe from the divide, create a world where more people live safely and thrive. A new chapter for those who come after.
So what do I do? 'Cause it feels like I'm going under, and my heart feels heavy. But I know now, yeah, I know I've gotta be stronger and make sure I can breathe.
Breathe for those we've lost. Breathe for those to come. Breathe for yourself so you can keep going strong, to keep going strong. Breathe for those we've lost. Breathe for those to come. Breathe for yourself so we can keep going strong, to keep going strong. Keep going strong, my friend. In terms of the Q&A, that can be really helpful for folks is if we did the content chunks and we did them in the fuel, equitable, and actions portion. And so I'll just go back in that order and give you a chance, if you had any questions about a specific element, to be able to ask. For example, we get the most questions about this diagram, especially when we start to connect the dots to the other equity pathways. So are there any questions and concerns about this, especially in terms of how it may relate to racial equity and reframing that in your workplace? And so you can either unmute yourself, or you can either unmute yourself, or you can put your question in the chat. And if you would rather ask your question privately, you can also send it to Brian Limmerman up there, and Brian Limmerman will read your question. So Questions or concerns about this?
Hello, Kemi, it's Andy.
Hey, Andy.
First of all, this chart and diagram, equity pathways, it's pretty incredible. I mean, it just really opens up your mind to how many things are to work on, but also, and how each one relates to each other. So really fantastic.
Thanks.
One of the things that you always talk about is, and ask the question, is everyone in your organization thriving?
Mm-hmm.
And that is just, to me, just hits home, really just hits me really with the cool thoughts and understanding. The process of trying to have the conversations or the tools to try to figure out what is good to make each individual person thrive is, I think, where a lot of help is needed in organizations. Because so that's kind of my question or comment.
Yeah, right. This is part of the reason we thank you so much for that, Andy. This is part of the reason that we had to visually represent it, and because we find that having even a visual representation sparks more conversation. And as you said, one of the key questions we ask our clients are, is everyone in your team thriving? And if folks are not even willing to discuss that question, then we already know that they're not a good fit for our work. But it's important that we ask them as leaders to then really understand what's preventing that. And some people give some of the pushback that I shared earlier when we talked about this diagram. So I'll jump around a little bit just to be able to answer that question. Right, some people give pushback when they see this diagram, and all of that is just the programming that we have about how work is supposed to go. And so for us to actually create an assessment, and you've seen, Andy has worked with us a little bit, you've seen when we actually pull together an assessment and the intentionality around creating questions that actually measure this as a starting point for then discussing what would it take for all of our team members to thrive. And it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is going to turn around the next day, but do people even have a pathway to have that conversation? We're seeking to provide that to more folks, because regardless of what the current answer is, whatever that answer is, we would want to take the shame and blame out of it to make sure that we can change the game, change the way we're playing the game, so we're not letting the game change the way we want to operate as human beings, and most importantly, give us a path forward. So yeah, we this is assessing. Besides being an education firm, we're very much being an assessment driven firm to give people the right tools at the right time to make the right choices. So thank you for that, Andy. And so we can also we can leave this diagram up now that we're hopping around. Questions and concerns about career equity in your organization.
Kemi, hi, I'm Rachel.
Hey, Rachel.
I sent a question to Brian, but I'm not sure if he got it. So I guess I'll just ask it because it falls into the equitable button. Not trying to throw you under the bus, Brian. Sorry about that.
I mean, no, but I appreciate
you probably have a lot going on. So I just want to make sure this question gets answered.
I totally don't see it here, Rachel. I'm so sorry.
I sent it to you directly. So it's okay. I just don't want to miss this chance because we're inequitable.
Go for it.
Rachel says, hey, you set the system up. Let's make sure it works. Thank you for the feedback, Rachel.
I am the barrier to Rachel's thriving.
You are the barrier to my progress here, Brian. So equitable.
Thanks,
so Kemi, as it relates to hiring, I often hear senior leaders say privately that they want to hire a more diverse team, especially at the higher levels. But they don't want to go on record publicly and make that commitment. Their fear is often that their non-minority employees will be offended. And or they will find themselves in a reverse discrimination situation, which seems to be coming up a lot lately. Like, what about us? Now we're being discriminated against. And that's from our non-minority colleagues and friends. So do you have any thoughts on how to address that situation when it comes up?
I appreciate it. And thanks for popping up on here and giving us a chance to step up our systems behind the scenes. So we'll say again, if you have any private messages, now Brian's going to be laser focused on this. And also the other point here is there's so many layers to that question, because even as people say, we want to hire some more diverse leadership, we're asking, so what does that mean? And then folks might hesitate, and then they start describing skin color, which would be visual diversity, right? So as we start having these conversations, we can break down these what diversity, what diverse backgrounds actually mean to folks. What's interesting too is that when we start having conversations around people's data, and we start having demographic comparisons, what's interesting is in an organization, anyone can be considered in a minority based on how the data shows up in your organization. Right, so there's many levels that we start to just have deeper conversations. So that's where I'm going to start by saying we start having deeper conversations about what people are actually looking for. The other like real bigger conversation that's like structurally in organizations is your organization set up to have fair pathways for everyone on your team? Because what's happening, we say this reverse discrimination. I mentioned earlier that we have this "what about me" culture. Hey, what about me? I'm being left behind. Oh, now I'm being discriminated against. Partly it's because people believe that when, say, for example, if I was hired to come and be in a leadership position in your team, they would say, well, he was only hired because he was Black. It's like, well, do we actually have qualifications listed? Do we have the actual specifications for the job listed in such a way that we can compare the dots and connect the dots, or compare applications and connect the dots? Like, this is why this decision was made. You don't have to agree with the decision. Equity doesn't mean people are going to agree with the decision, but it's a fair decision. It's not a decision that's trying to favor one group or another. It's a fair decision. Some people have not. Then if you have that, which a lot of groups do not have, right? They've been making hiring decisions based on how they feel about people. And that already is going to lead to so much inequity that then some folks who've been waiting, so the kind of key piece you just said, some people have been waiting for that job to show up because they haven't had career development. They haven't had career advancement. They've been waiting for that chance. And all of a sudden, some random cool Black guy with dreads gets the job. It's going to be a problem. And then that means I'm the problem, even though I had nothing to do with those choices. So if we take this in a couple steps, this is why I'm like, we're going to assess before we make a mess. We're going to find out what they actually mean when they say they're trying to diversify the leadership. What has prevented that from happening up until now? We would certainly want to do a preliminary assessment of, does our team feel like they're thriving and have the pathways to grow? Because if you already have diverse members of your team right now, and they don't even have a chance to get that, what is preventing that? Let's look at these barrier points and have a real conversation, because even if those things are not, poof, changed, it's important for your team to know that, to be able to better have a firm and equitable answer to these questions when people bring them up. Right now, people, you just said at the beginning of your statement, they're saying it to you privately, not saying it publicly, because they're concerned about the backlash, but they're also concerned that if people look any closer, they're going to see a lot of inequity. This is why it's really important that we start to clear these problems up. They're not disconnected. A lot of people want to go recruitment as the first solution. We're like, man, if your team hasn't been working with people from diverse backgrounds yet, what's all of a sudden going to make that possible now? So it sounds like for them, they might be an initiating. And there's that's why some of the executive coaching, I'm telling you, we're seeing a bunch of versions of this. Executive coaching to help that leader think through some of this before they come and say it to the team, or so they don't have to necessarily keep saying it privately, that they can actually embrace that. And then the kind of support to build it out in your team. That's what you would start to get in the initiating phase. Thank you for the multifaceted question, right? We have to.
Thank you, Kevin.
Did you type all of that, by the way? Did you type? Oh, man, okay, we gotta get some credit. So, thank you for typing it and then coming on the mic to ask it. Appreciate you.
All right. So since I got thrown under the bus, I now have a list of questions. So this one's from Tiffany. Tiffany asks, what is the best way to accurately assess where an organization is? Surveys are regularly / quarterly distributed, but participation is dismal, and there's no way to know how honest / accurate / representative those responses are.
All right. So that's big. How many of you have taken a survey and have not seen the results of that in your company? You can put your hand. All right, if you like, so let's look at representative right now. There's a lot of people who are saying, yep. First of all, if you're doing surveys quarterly, I would ask, are people then seeing those results? right? Because if people are not seeing the results of the ones you're already doing or seeing how the data is impacting them or how change is coming from that, then they're not going to contribute to ones around diversity, equity, inclusion. Like, well, I'll tell you that right now, because they're like, well, if just regular information wasn't recirculated back to me, what's going to happen with this information? So there's mistrust, and we'll tell you, mistrust is one of the most expensive problems a company can have, because not many people will come outright and say, oh, I mistrust you, leader. And then people are like, why are you still working there? It's like, well, this might be the best thing I have, but I know that this is kind of shredding my values, or I feel like it's out of integrity, or I feel like they say stuff and they change their mind. These are things that we hear all the time. So the first thing I'll tell you to do is if you're already running assessments, make sure you're sharing that back with your team in a way that allows them to see that their data, their input is not only being honored, it's also being shared back with them, and it's being utilized to make change, right? Because then people are like, why are you asking me a question if you're not going to change it? Which is the next piece of really what we've learned the hard way last year, is to really own, at this point, we'll say, assess what you are ready to solve and to do something about. Because sometimes we get too much data and then we are overwhelmed. And oftentimes what happens when you gather data is some people feel like their experiences are finally validated. They're not the only one. They're not crazy for feeling the way they've been feeling inside your organization. Whereas other people feel like, dang, I've been working so hard to make this inclusive. How come that's not shown in the assessment? So that happens at the exact same time when people see the results. So it's important that as we're sharing that feedback, we're having those kind of conversations. But similar to what we did here, we've also been front loading it with people and saying, what if this was your data? What would you do about it? To prepare them to do something better with data. And that way it's not so alarming. So as we zoom up to your question, I would say, if you're already doing assessments, please share them more regularly, and let that be the norm in your team. And then when you talk about making it more representative, as you start to share data from previous assessments, you can even say, hey, we have very low attendance, or what we perceive to be low attendance. We generally aim for 80%, because we just know 20% of folks either won't do it, or we don't want to force people to do assessments, especially if they're just now getting used to it. So we aim for 80%. And so if we hit 80%, most groups a lot of groups will see when we tell them it's 80%, people are like, okay, great. We're not pressured to this, we're not forced to do an assessment, and we generally get higher than 80% anyhow. But so when you say it's not representative, I don't know what numbers you're talking about, but I would try to pinpoint what is a fair number for your team. And then as you start to communicate that and build the trust, you will see more people start to share to your assessment. And then they also will be more likely to give you demographic information. A lot of times people will bring us in as outsiders because people trust outsiders more, which is wild. It's wild. If your team would trust us more as outsiders, then there's a bigger problem. And we're happy to help you close that gap. But just know that if your team's like, we need an outside source, well, they're saying, hey, we don't trust our team inside to protect that information and to not use it for retaliation purposes. So please know that that's part of the reason we want to help people build trust and safety. So thank you for that question. Now we're getting deep. I feel like I got to stand back up. All right, Brian, I'll do that while you ask the next question.
You got it. So while you're standing up, Ashley asks, what are thoughts on making sure you are serving a diverse client base?
Happy to clarify. I'm actually launching a new business, and I just want to make sure that it's part of my business plan. Like, I don't want to be coming to you in 5 years and saying, hey, why is my clientele like so messed up? So,
Yeah.
how do I make sure I start, like, if I want to, a diverse practice, if I want to make sure that I'm including everyone in what I do, what are some thoughts on how do I build that in to start with?
Beautiful. Thank you there for the clarification, especially
Sure.
as you're starting out, right? Because ideal client conversations, right? We're always told you have to get really close to your ideal client, and part of that process will bring a lot of bias. And I think folks are just now starting to realize, oh, I can really pinpoint who my ideal client is, and I'm just assuming that everybody else. There's been times where we've shown up to buy something from someone, and they treat me very differently than I perceive they think they would treat their ideal client. And I'm like, I'm trying to buy this from you. Like, why are you treating me this way, right? So there's multiple levels of this where it's, when you think about your ideal client, I think it's great to start with someone you have in mind and say, are we putting up any barriers of entry for people right? Barriers to entry to get our products and services. And there's difference between boundaries and barriers, right? For example, we're certainly putting a boundary around how many people can get a call with me, right? Like we've slowed that down as a very much a boundary. But are we creating a barrier for people to get access to information from us? No. Actually, Leanne was giving us some thoughts around thank you for making it more accessible. And we're saying, yeah, we're trying to get it as accessible as possible for people to have the information and to really understand how to interact with our service and with our team. However, we are putting boundaries around me. So it's separating boundaries from barriers, right? So if we look at our ideal client, we start to think about, are we creating any barriers for anybody else? And as we ask that question, we can say, how do we reduce barriers for more people to become our clients, right? And that is a stage of maturity model still. You're very much in the initiating phase, right? So I'll say right now, sell to people who are going to pay you for your thing, right? Just go ahead and do that without making sure you're not preventing other people who from actually engaging with you, especially if it's just based on bias. And then the other piece that, as we see, we've been asking this question, can you have customer lifetime value without employee lifetime value? I'll say it again. Can you have customer lifetime value without employee lifetime value? What we have found the answer is no, because we've seen where people are divesting their money they're spending in certain agencies or certain organizations because of the way they treat their team members. And we also know that when team members leave and when team members have poor customer service, oftentimes it's a poor reflection of the organization. And the way that connects to your diverse audience, if you want to make sure you're authentically serving a wider and wider audience, bring on team members who represent that audience. And they don't have to be a token person to speak on behalf of all Black people, like some people expect me to do. I'm like, I don't speak on behalf of all Black people. I certainly can give you one perspective that can help. And then as we have a more diverse perspectives in our team, we're able to authentically reach a wider audience, and then also check in with the audience as we go to make sure our practices are inclusive and more inclusive for the folks who we continue to attract. Like we just learned something today, for example, that we have enabled closed captioning for people to have closed captioning in the main sessions, but the breakout rooms don't have closed captioning. So we want to make sure that our sessions are accessible. We can make that announcement moving forward and let people know that they go into breakout rooms, they won't have closed captioning, and then they can stay in here with us and make sure that we can support them as well and have those conversations. So we just learned that today. So we want to make our experiences more engaging. We also heard from Rachel, obviously, that like, okay, if we're going to put the thing out for reading questions, that we can read the questions. So this is opportunities for people to help us be more inclusive. And so you're seeing it in real time, right? So thank you both for the opportunity.
Getting our systems in order. Thank you for that. All right. So Alana asks, I work for an organization of 4 staff. How do we address issues of equity without getting personal?
Yeah, the smaller the team, it's wild too. I appreciate that because I think somebody else asked if we have under 20 folks. And when you say issues of equity, you're talking about issues of equity in your workplace, right? Because I'm going to make sure we bring it back down to there, because some people, when they start talking about it, they're like thinking about the whole world. And I'm like, man, there's a lot of different conversations. So if there's only 4 of you, and our core team is very small as well at Fears Advantage. And so what we have learned is that we're still doing the questions around levels of safety and trust in our organization, even before we started asking the big questions, because even though we couldn't see who was answering, we got a sense of, hey, if somebody doesn't feel safe in our team, there's only 4 of us, we could potentially be trying to make guesses, but the data would still be anonymous. So again, we weren't asking that much demographic data until we could confirm that we had the levels of trust and safety, because as soon as you start asking demographic data, if you have 4 people, you're gonna be like, I think Kim is the only Black one here, so I'm pretty sure that's him, right? So that would be much harder to do. So start with questions around trust and safety, and then we can. So you sound like you're in that initiating phase, so we can start with those questions. And I would say this is probably a perfect opportunity for a roundtable, because one diagram that we haven't shown in here is our cultural equity diagram, and it's a diagram that has a bunch of different ways that we show up as diverse. So one question that we can have in a roundtable with your team is, what parts of yourself do you feel like you can bring to our organization and you can't bring? Because that can give you a sense right away of where your team feels like they're being included and feels like they may be excluded, and how do we bridge that gap? It's great when you're small. Please, I mean, when people say, when should we start thinking about culture and DEI? Pretty much as soon as you start your organization, right? We just heard from Ashley there. I'm thinking about my customers, but also as soon as you hire somebody else, by proxy, you already have another person there. There's already diversity, equity, inclusion that's needed just to communicate to that person. And as you have that back and forth and you start adding more and more people, it just broadens the complexity. But it's important that if you start with DEI as an anchor and then build that safety within that core 4 that you have right now, you can continue to expand it, which will then which would prevent different challenges, but also different benefits and different success stories, right? We just love to hear how people do this at different levels. So thank you for giving a chance to speak into your team that's small right now, small and mighty. Let's go.
All right. Crystal asks, what is the best way to respond to members of your leadership that express that they do not find meaning or relevance in carving time and space to addressing or discussing DEI related topics during meetings?
Oh, yeah. Great question. Whew. One question becomes, what problem are you trying to solve with DEI inside your organization? And as most times we ask people that question, like, oh, we don't know what problems we're trying to solve. It's like, yeah, I'll tell you, as for me, as an executive, like, obviously we were focused on DEI, but there's other things that people want to talk to me about, and it's not trying to solve an immediate problem. It's just less of a priority. So we very much operate from that executive perspective. Okay, what DEI problems are we trying to solve in our organization? When people start to see data like this, it's a different conversation because we're trying to solve a problem inside the organization with their team members. As I said before, when you're talking to senior leadership, it's important to find out who are the ones who are willing to have the conversation, because initiating with them and helping them see that we're actually having a conversation around career equity is a different journey than trying to get somebody who's very resistant to have any of these conversations, because that person can actually help be like a Rosetta Stone for you. Like, how can we communicate this differently to the rest of the team? So it's like essentially finding an ally at your executive leadership level, and that way people, you can really start to speak this conversation in a way they understand. This is for us, we know the 2 core groups that we're supporting are executives and implementers. So there's executives, like, because executives don't realize how much they're preventing by just not even having these conversations. That's the saddest part. They think they're really concerned about what they might lose out on, and they don't realize how much time. They say, like, hey, we don't have time for this, but people are wasting time doing things in the background, avoiding certain people, spending over an hour writing an email to someone they know is going to take it the wrong way. We're like, that's a lot more time wasted than just having the freaking conversation. This is why we support executives and we support implementers. The goal is to help people get in alignment, to increase the safety across the board, so that we can have these conversations about thriving in your workplace. Not just DEI for DEI's sake, but DEI for the sake of making sure everybody in your organization can thrive. And we'll just keep going with like 3 more questions. And if you have to hop off. But this is, as I said, we've limited access to me until you become an actual client. So we'll answer a couple more questions here before we hop off.
All right, so Jan asks, what are the tools that can be used right now to provide change for smaller companies under 20 employees? Like Alana mentioned, what are the good first steps to take to involve all colleagues at the company and build up a culture together?
Awesome. Some of y'all have been on the call since the beginning. Y'all know the answer. We're going to say assess instead of make a mess. Let's go. Right? But we'll tell you to first do this, right? Take this DEI maturity assessment, because the goal of this is that it'll take you about 3 minutes to complete, and it'll ask you questions that help you find what stage you are in your team, right? Because for those of you who missed this portion, we have a list of services that are helpful to start with based on where you are in this maturity model. And that's, so to answer your question, it's really hard to say. If your whole team isn't initiating, it might be helpful to have a keynote and to have a talk like this that helps them get some more of the alignment and also understand what's possible or it might be helpful to have an action class, which is a training, so folks can get some tools to already put this into practice. So that's essentially what you're asking, version of what's the first thing to do. We will tell you to please take the time. You can go right now to fearsadvantage.com and just complete this. And if you're on a small enough team, you can even have your other team members complete this too and say, hey, what was the score? How did you rate our organization? Let's talk about that. And that can become a great way to actually initiate the conversation. And when you complete the assessment, this little assessment actually sends you an email with the summary. So you all have it. So you can actually compare notes, like why did we rate it one way and other people rate it a different way? So that's a great way to start, especially it's a way to start for free. And it'll kind of give you a sense of where you are in your organization, and then we can help to align the proper services to support you. There's a lot of people who are like overselling things and saying you need to do all these steps, which make it even more overwhelming. We're saying we want to help you with the right solutions so you can make the right decisions right now. All right, Brian, let's go.
All right, so it looks like one of the last questions I have in here from Tanisha. The stages of DEI maturity are aligned with the different recommended client success solutions. Would you say it is better to avoid jumping around solutions with different maturity levels? And if so, why? How do you know when employees are ready for higher DEI maturity solutions? I feel like we kind of half answered that just now, right?
That's a great question. If you're someone like me, you're like, I'm pretty sure, like, I like to make things up. If you came back from the breakout room, you heard remixes. So I love remixing things. I will tell you that in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, that kind of hopping around can create more stalling and can actually create more friction. One thing that to note though, a lot of the services will continue on, right? So if you notice the blocks here, so if you're someone who's saying, hey, we absolutely want to mix and match, notice that in progressing, there's quite a bit of services you can still mix and match. And if you're in aligning, there's even more, because we know it takes a lot to bring your team together, and it's just about two different approaches to kind of meet at the right place. So I think the short answer to your question is, as you determine your area and help to really get some confirmation of where you are, there's multiple stacks of services that can be helpful. And that way, as you go forward, you're saying, great, we're in aligning, for example. We know that these trainings help. Now we're ready to really progress. Let's start to build this out more intentionally, do a learning and development plan. And then if we're wanting to get into building, we say, great, let's do a strategic plan to align these pieces. And that way we actually know how these things are happening in harmony versus disharmony. I don't think you'd be surprised how many organizations bring us in and we start asking questions, and there's somebody else working on a project that's very related, but they're not talking to each other. So then they feel like we're conflicting and competing. We're like, no, we're just here to support you, but you have to tell us what you're working on so we can help make sure what we give you aligns with your strategic goals and other initiatives that are already in motion. That way folks feel like it is a united front forward. So hopefully that answers your question. You can absolutely combine and remix services within that same maturity stage and create the unique solution that will get your team the wins that allow progress to happen. All right. She said that was the last question you had. Thank you all for being able to ask your questions and staying a little bit later to have this conversation with us. I appreciate y'all on many levels. This is our kickoff to the year. Thank you for giving me a chance to do what I love to do, which is speak, and then really continue to honor the work of Dr. King by bringing this work into the work environment in a way that's relevant, that can speak to the business case and actually create more business solutions inside of your organization. Thank y'all for that. And then we will close out with, let's close out with Hey Yo. Yeah, since y'all are still here. So for those of you who are still here, what we're gonna do is called Hey Yo. We get to take this positive energy with us. And when we take the positive energy with us, we're gonna have our hands just below the screen. We're gonna go, hey yo, and then we're gonna pour it on ourselves. Like, we need as much positivity as we can take. All right. So for those of you who want to join us, you can unmute yourself for a moment. It's gonna get a little bit chaotic, but that's great. So we're gonna do this together on the count of 3. We're gonna go 1, 2, 3. Let's go. I mean, we were pretty close, but for us, it's the idea that life doesn't have to be perfect to be wonderful, and you don't have to be perfect to do this work in a powerful way. So thank you so much